My name is Sarah Collins, and the night my father pointed to the front door and said, "Get out and never come back," I put my hand on the brass knob and opened it, never imagining I'd hear his name again a decade later when the clerk read it from a docket marked defendant. It had started like so many Sundays in our Akron split level, the smell of pot roast and cloves, the tick of the kitchen clock chewing the quiet between my mother's questions and my father's grunts. The dining room was still dressed in the 1990s, burgundy curtains, a hutch crowded with porcelain birds. The good plates, no one in our family was good enough to chip. I was 19, home from my sophomore year finals with a single duffel, and the kind of optimism only people who haven't paid their own health insurance possess. "Your hair," Mom said, sliding the roast onto a platter. "You cut it again." "It's summer," I said. "It's easier." Dad watched me the way he watched weather, skeptical that sunshine would last. He'd worked 30 years at the tire plant before becoming a foreman, then became a foreman who reminded you he was a foreman. He had foreman hands and a voice like gravel pulled behind a truck. I waited until the potatoes made their second slow circle around the table before I said it. I got the internship. Mom's fork paused midair. "At the courthouse." "County prosecutor's office," I said, and I couldn't help the smile. "It's paid." Dad's jaw flexed. "So you'll spend a summer in a room full of liars and think you're better than your own family." "It's experience," I said, lighter than the truth. It was more than experience. It was a door. Experience. He carved the word the way he carved meat, sawing. Experience fixing what's broken here would be better. Your brother's truck is still shot. Your mother can't mow with her back. There's plenty to experience at home. Mom took the tray. "Your father's just saying." "He's saying I shouldn't go," I said. Dad set his knife down, and the room went smaller. "I'm saying quit chasing other people's business and learn some loyalty." The clock on the wall clicked to 6:14 loud as a gavel. The house held its breath. This was the rhythm of our family. I brought a life into the room, and the room tried to suffocate it. "I can help with the yard this week," I said, because that's what the youngest child does, barters pieces of herself for permission to keep the rest. "Then I start Monday." "You start nothing," he said, and a line I'd never crossed lay there between us like a live wire. "You think you're smarter because of that campus. You come home with new words and a smart mouth." All the old arguments spilled like nails from a torn bag. Mom compared me to Mark, who had moved 3 towns over and called twice a month as if distance were a virtue when a son performed it. Dad reminded me who paid what the roof over my head. Back then, cleats for JV soccer, the orthodontist. I hadn't asked for, but thanked him for anyway. The pot roast cooled in its own juice. I stared at the family portrait above the buffet. 4 people framed in a Sears smile, everyone's hands on everyone else, like we were afraid to float away. "Dad," I tried softer. "This matters to me. What matters is respect." He pushed his chair back so hard it bit the hardwood. "You think you're better? You think you can leave whenever you want and crawl back when it suits you." "I didn't crawl. I came home for dinner." "You came here to announce a decision you'd already made," he said, and he wasn't wrong, which only made me angrier. "Because I knew if I asked, you'd say no." Mom's eyes flicked between us like a referee who doesn't want to blow the whistle. Her napkin trembled in her lap. Somewhere down the block, a mower coughed to life. Cut grass drifted in green and damp, a summer smell that felt like every June of my childhood, sticky palms, chalk on the driveway running until my lungs burned. Dad stood. He did not shout yet. He let the silence stack until it towered over me. Then he leveled it with one swing. "Get out." The 2 words hit like cold water. "Robert," Mom said, using his name like a hand on a shoulder. He didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on me, flinty lit with something I still don't like to name. "Get out," he said again, slower, as if enunciating for the hard of hearing, "and never come back." The room tilted. I could feel the pulse in my throat, a small trapped thing. I thought of everything I could say that he didn't mean it. That anger was a language he'd learned in a house where love came with chores attached and silence was safer than truth. I thought of the internship letter heavy in my purse like a passport. I thought absurdly of the St. Christopher medal my grandmother had pressed into my palm the summer she died warm from her skin. "Okay," I said. His eyebrows ticked as if he'd expected me to beg. I stood my chair legs scuffing a protest across the floor and went to my old room where everything smelled faintly of dust and Bath and Body Works vanilla. The bedspread still had sunflowers. The corkboard still had the ticket stub from Homecoming, the Polaroid of me and Tess. Arms thrown around each other like we could build a bridge with our elbows. I pulled the duffel from the closet and started folding. Jeans, 2 t-shirts, the internship letter flat and official. The metal chain looped around my finger once, twice. Mom appeared in the doorway. She didn't cross the threshold. Sarah just what I kept my voice level because one of us had to. He said what he wanted. Tears made her mascara shine. She looked tired in the way women look when they've spent their choices on everyone else. He's upset. So am I. He didn't mean, oh. He always means it when he wants to hurt, I said, and the truth of that left both of us blinking. She glanced back down the hall toward the man who had turned our home into a place you learn to measure your words. "I'll talk to him," she said. "Don't," I said. He heard me. I heard him. I should tell you I was brave. I wasn't. I was steady, which is a cousin you can take to court. I zipped the bag, lifted it, and the weight was exactly what it should be, enough to carry, not enough to crush. At the door, Dad stood with his arms crossed like a bouncer. Through the storm glass, the front yard glowed flat-screen green. Our red maple moved lightly in a breeze that didn't dare call itself wind. Our mailbox leaned a little to the left, the way it had since Mark backed into it last winter and promised to fix it. "You walking to campus?" Dad said. "Or should I call one of your big shot professors?" "I'll call Tess," I said. "She owes me gas money." That almost made me smile. Almost. He opened the door with a flourish, as if he'd been the gentleman the whole time. Mayflies jittered in the frame. I stepped onto the porch where I'd watched 1,000 summers rinse the street in heat. It smelled like grill smoke and someone's dryer sheets. "Sarah," Mom said behind me, her voice thin as a thread. I didn't trust my throat. I gripped the railing. The paint had bubbled last winter and never been sanded. One day I would learn there is a kind of grief that comes from all the things people didn't fix when they had the chance. "Never come back," Dad said, as if the first command hadn't landed hard enough. I turned, then not to argue, just to look, to memorize. His face was ruddy from beer and pride. He had my eyes, which felt like a betrayal my DNA had planned, without asking me. For a heartbeat, I saw him as a boy, the son of a man who'd said worse. Then, he was only my father again, choosing the easier cruelty. "Okay," I said, because sometimes the most grown-up thing you can do is believe people when they tell you who they are. I walked down the steps. The maple's leaves whispered like gossip. At the curb, I set the duffel down and called Tess. "Can you swing by?" "What happened?" "I'll tell you when you get here," I said, and when I hung up, I let myself look back once. Through the screen, Dad was a shape filling a doorway, Mom a shadow behind him. They were the house. I was the air. A robin hopped in the grass, tugging something invisible from the earth. A pickup rattled past with a ladder strapped on top, bungee cords flapping. A siren keened somewhere far away and then faded like a bad idea. I pressed the St. Christopher to my palm until it left a print. The sky over Akron was a pale blue bowl, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the space above me instead of the ceiling. I didn't know what the courthouse smelled like at 8 a.m. on a Monday in June. I didn't know how fluorescent lights would turn me into a person who loved paper and precision and the way truth can click into place like a buckle. I didn't know there was a word for the thing I wanted: order. What I knew was this: I would not be back by morning. I would not be back by fall. I would build a life that didn't require permission slips from the people who taught me. Love was something you earned by being smaller than your own voice. Tess's car turned the corner, sun flashing off her windshield. I picked up my bag. My hand smelled like metal in summer. I took the last step off that lawn. The first summer on my own was a blur of double shifts and borrowed couches. At 19, I thought independence would feel like freedom, but mostly it felt like exhaustion. The kind that sits in your bones and makes even a laundromat chair feel like a mattress. I kept my internship at the prosecutor's office, though the pay barely covered bus fare and instant noodles. Every morning, I walked through the courthouse doors with shoes still damp from the dew of the bus stop grass, clutching a coffee I couldn't afford. The marble floors echoed under my steps, a sound that made me feel small and important at once. Inside the office, everything smelled like toner and stale paper. My supervisor, Ms. Reynolds, had hair the color of iron and eyes that missed nothing. On my first day, she handed me a stack of case files so thick I thought she was joking. Read them. Learn the pattern, she said. Law is as much about patterns as it is about facts. So, I read. Theft, assault, broken contracts, broken lives, stories written in affidavits and police reports, and every time a father's name appeared on a file, my chest tightened. I'd picture my own dad's handwriting on the charge sheet. His jaw set the way it had been the night he told me to leave. Outside work, I scraped together money however I could. Waitressing at Eddie's Diner from 6 p.m. to midnight meant my hair always smelled like grease and onions. On good nights, I made $40 in tips. On bad nights, I went home with 10 and blistered feet. When the library called needing a part-time shelver, I said yes, without thinking, even though it meant juggling 3 jobs. I survived on peanut butter sandwiches and the stubborn belief that forward was the only direction left. Tess teased me for color-coding my notebooks, but organization was the only control I had. I taped my internship badge above my futon like a talisman. Every morning when I woke, I reminded myself, this is the start of something bigger. Still, there were nights when loneliness crawled in. Nights when the silence of my phone, no calls from home, felt louder than traffic outside my window. Sometimes I almost dialed just to hear my mother's voice, even if it came sharpened with criticism. But then I'd picture my father's face as he said, "Never come back," and I put the phone down. By August, the courthouse began to feel like a second skin. I watched trials unfold from the gallery, scribbling notes. One day, a tenant case caught my attention, an old woman in a faded blue dress testifying how her landlord refused to fix the heat all winter. Her hands trembled as she spoke, but her voice was steady. The defense lawyer tried to rattle her, but she kept her gaze fixed on the judge, not budging an inch. I carried her image home with me. She reminded me of something I couldn't yet name, the quiet strength of people who refuse to break, even when the world wants them to. When the internship ended, Ms. Reynolds called me into her office. I braced myself for polite dismissal. Instead, she handed me a letter of recommendation, sealed with the county's stamp. "You've got grit," she said. "Don't waste it." Her words lodged deep. I walked out clutching that envelope like it was gold. For once, someone saw value in me, not as a daughter who failed to measure up, but as a woman who could stand on her own. That fall, I doubled down at school. While my classmates spent weekends at frat parties, I buried myself in case law and outlines. Sleep became a luxury, but ambition kept me upright. Professors began to notice. One Dr. Whitman lingered after class one day. "You ever consider law school?" He asked, his voice casual, but his eyes sharp. I laughed because laughter was easier than admitting how badly I wanted it. Me, law school. "Why not you?" he said. "You've got the brain for it. More importantly, you've got the fight." The word fight stuck with me. It was the one thing my father always accused me of doing: too much fight, too much mouth, too much stubbornness. But maybe those things could be currency here in this world of statutes and precedents. By winter break, I'd made my decision. Law school wasn't just a dream. It was the map out of the shadow my father had cast over me. I filled out applications with hands that shook but didn't stop. Each essay was a quiet declaration: I will not be defined by the night I left. I will define myself by what I build. When the acceptance letter from Ohio State arrived, I opened it alone at my kitchen table. Snow tapped the window, the radiator clanked like an old man's bones. I read the words 3 times before they sank in. My throat burned with something between joy and grief. I wanted to call home, to tell them to hear pride in my father's voice for once. But pride had never been his gift to me, and so I sat in that little apartment letter, spread across the table, and whispered to the empty room, You did it, Sarah. The silence that followed was the first silence that felt like peace. Law school was nothing like undergrad. If college was about cramming and caffeine, law school was a battlefield where words became weapons and every lecture felt like a duel. The Socratic method stripped you bare. Professors barked questions without warning, and if you fumbled, the whole lecture hall watched you flounder. I learned quickly to be ready. My textbooks were lined with sticky notes like neon armor. Every night I traced case law until the words blurred, then rewrote them in my own hand so they would stick. Some students coasted on charm or legacy names. I clawed my way forward with ink-stained fingers and determination that felt almost physical. A weight in my chest I carried to class each morning. Still, there were moments of doubt. My first semester, a professor dismantled my argument in front of 70 classmates. My cheeks burned so hot, I thought I'd blister. Later, I sat in the library bathroom staring at the graffiti on the stall door. Someone had scrawled, "You belong here." I didn't know who wrote it, but I whispered the words until they steadied me. By second year, something shifted. The cases stopped feeling like foreign puzzles and started clicking into place. I joined the moot court team, my voice shaking the first time I stood at the podium. Halfway through, I caught sight of a judge leaning forward, listening closely. That small gesture lit a fire. For the first time, I believed my voice carried weight. Outside class, I worked part-time at a legal aid clinic. That's where I met Mr. Alvarez, a tenant fighting eviction. He was 60, with hands scarred from decades in construction, and eyes that carried both defiance and defeat. His landlord wanted him out citing nonsense violations. I prepared his file late into the night, piecing together receipts, photos, testimonies. When we walked into court, my heart pounded louder than my heels. I wasn't licensed yet, so I sat at the table while a supervising attorney argued. But when Mr. Alvarez won the right to stay in his apartment, he gripped my hand afterward. "You saved my home?" he said. I shook my head. The law did. But inside I knew it was more than that. It was persistence. It was seeing a man no one else saw. It was the same stubborn fight that once got me branded disrespectful under my father's roof. Here, it was power. Sometimes, though, the courtroom felt too close to home. One case involved a father accused of striking his son. Watching the boy testify, shoulders curled, inward voice barely audible, made my stomach twist. I could almost smell Sunday dinners again, the heavy silence before my father's temper flared. That night, I dreamed I was back at our dining table, only this time I had a gavel. Each time my father raised his voice, I struck it down the echo, drowning him out. I woke with my heart racing, but also with clarity. The law wasn't just a career. It was my language for fighting back without screaming. Graduation came with a blur of black robes and camera flashes. As I stood holding my diploma, I thought of calling home. I pictured my mother's polite voice, my father's silence. Instead, I tucked the thought away and smiled for the camera. The applause wasn't theirs, but it was enough. Passing the bar was another mountain. Weeks of study flashcards stacked like sandbags. When the letter came saying, "Congratulations," I sat on the floor of my tiny apartment and cried harder than I had in years. Not because I doubted my ability, but because for the first time, I felt undeniable. No one, not even my father, could take this from me. My first job was with the county prosecutor's office, the same place I once fetched coffee and sorted files. Now, I was standing before juries presenting evidence, calling witnesses. The courtroom lights buzzed overhead, the air always too dry, but it felt like home. Colleagues joked I was relentless, Collins the bulldog. I didn't mind. Better bulldog than doormat. I learned to live with late nights and cold pizza dinners, chasing justice across stacks of motions. And yet, in quiet moments, the old ache lingered. After a big conviction, I'd walk back to my empty apartment, heels echoing in the hallway, wishing someone was waiting to say, "I'm proud of you." But the phone never rang. One evening, after a long day in court, I passed by a storefront window. In the reflection, I saw myself, professional suit trial bag, slung over my shoulder, eyes sharp. For a moment, I didn't see the girl who was told to get out. I saw a woman who had made a life from nothing but grit. Still part of me whispered, would it matter to him if he saw me now? I shook the thought off. The answer didn't matter. What mattered was that I belonged in the courtroom, in the law, in the skin I had fought to own. I was no longer the daughter who begged for permission. I was the woman who would one day lift a gavel and command silence. The years that followed were less about winning cases and more about learning how to live in the long, quiet after the verdicts. My 20s slipped into my 30s inside courtrooms, law libraries, and apartments that always felt temporary, like I was still waiting for permission to settle down. Work consumed me, and I let it. Each morning, I arrived at the courthouse before the janitors had finished polishing the marble floors. By nightfall, I was still there, reviewing motions under fluorescent lights that hummed like insects. There was comfort in the routine, the ritual of filing cabinets, the shuffle of papers, the way all rise rolled through the room like a hymn. But silence followed me home. Some colleagues unwound with families with children's laughter echoing in their kitchens. I returned to rooms where the only voice was the hum of the fridge and the occasional clink of a glass. I dated once or twice, but ambition scared people off. Or maybe it was the shadow I carried still haunted by a door slammed behind me a decade earlier. I did visit the old neighborhood once. I parked at the end of the block and watched from a distance as the maple tree in our front yard reached higher than the roofline. The house itself looked tired, paint peeling on the shutters. My father's truck sat crooked in the driveway, the same dent in the fender from years back. For a moment, I thought about walking up, knocking, seeing what they would say. But then, I heard his voice in memory, sharp as a blade, never come back. I stayed in the car, hands tight on the wheel, and drove away before anyone spotted me. The absence of family left a kind of ache I couldn't fully name. Holidays were the hardest. Thanksgiving dinners at colleagues' houses, where I brought pies from the grocery store and smiled while people asked if my parents were visiting soon. I'd nod vaguely, deflecting with stories about long trials. No one needed to know that I spent Christmas mornings with coffee and court transcripts instead of stockings and cinnamon rolls. It was in those silence years that I rose through the ranks, first assistant prosecutor, then senior counsel. Every promotion was both victory and burden proof that I had built a fortress of competence so high it kept everything else out. My colleagues toasted with champagne. I went home and poured myself a glass of red wine, staring at my reflection in the dark window. There were small joys that tethered me. Morning runs in the park where frost clung to the grass, moments when my lungs burned clean. Afternoons spent at the public library sitting in the children's section, just to hear the hum of young voices, their laughter unburdened. A stray cat adopted me for a while, curling up on my fire escape, watching the world with the same wary eyes I wore to work. Yet beneath the routines, a question lingered. Was all this enough? One night, after a particularly grueling trial, I sat alone in my office, the verdict still echoing. Guilty. Justice served. But instead of relief, I felt hollow. I imagined my father in the gallery, arms crossed, eyes unimpressed, ready to point out flaws even in triumph. That ghost never left me. I began keeping a journal, something I hadn't done since high school. Late at night, I wrote not about statutes or rulings, but about memory, my mother's sighs at the dinner table, my brother's laughter in the backyard, my father's hand slamming the doorframe. I wrote until my hand cramped, and still the pages couldn't contain it all. Time moved differently then. Birthdays came and went without celebration. Friends married, had children, moved into houses with backyards. I remained in the city in an apartment that felt more like a staging ground than a home. But the silence, as heavy as it was, also hardened me. When the appointment came to serve as a judge, it felt less like a surprise and more like an inevitability. I had earned a reputation for fairness, for an unflinching attention to detail. The robe felt strange at first, heavy on my shoulders, but when I lifted the gavel for the first time, something clicked inside me. It was more than authority. It was a reclamation. And yet, even from the bench, I carried the past. Every defendant who tried to stare me down reminded me of my father's glare across the dinner table. Every plea for mercy echoed my mother's soft apologies. The difference was that now, my voice carried weight. Now, when I spoke, the room listened. Still, I wondered if he could see me now. Would he recognize what I had become? Would he care? I never thought I'd get the answer. It was a gray Tuesday morning when the clerk slid the docket across my desk. The stack was routine petty theft DUI, a smattering of civil disputes. My eyes skimmed line after line until they caught on a name. Richard Collins. I froze. My pen slipped, leaving a blue scar across the margin. 10 years had passed since I'd heard that name spoken in my presence. 10 years since I had walked away from the maple tree and the peeling shutters. For a moment, I thought it must be someone else. Collins isn't rare, but then I saw the address. My childhood home, the house with burgundy curtains and a dent in the living room wall. There was no mistaking it. The charge was embezzlement. Fraudulent handling of funds at a small manufacturing company where he'd been a mid-level manager. The numbers in the complaint told a story of desperation accounts, siphoned expenses, falsified money moved like shells in a rigged game. My throat tightened. The room around me blurred the hum of clerks, the shuffle of papers, even the low creak of the courthouse radiator, all of it distant. In the hollow center of the noise, I was 19 again, standing in the doorway with a duffel bag while his voice thundered, "Get out and never come back." I closed the file quickly, but it didn't close inside me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced my apartment lights off, listening to the city outside my window. A siren wailed down the avenue. Somewhere, a couple argued, their voices muffled through the walls. I kept hearing the clerk's neutral tone as she read the case list aloud earlier, my father's name no heavier to her than any other. To me, it weighed a decade. I pulled out my journal pen, shaking. I wrote the name at the top of the page, Richard Collins. Defendant. Seeing it in ink broke something loose. Memories poured out, the way he slammed his palm on the table when he didn't like my answers, the silence that followed his rage, the way my mother smoothed it over like wallpaper over cracked plaster. But the case wasn't about the past. It was about the present. And the present meant I had a choice. By law, I could recuse myself, hand the gavel to another judge and step aside. The ethical thing, maybe the easy thing, but as I stared at the file again the next morning, I knew I wouldn't. Not out of vengeance, at least I told myself that, but because life had turned the wheel until his fate rolled into my courtroom. And maybe for once, I needed him to see me. The week leading up to the hearing stretched like wire pulled too tight. Each day I buried myself in other cases, but the thought of Friday circled my mind like a hawk. I saw his name in my sleep, his face in every shadow of my dreams. Colleagues noticed my tension. "You all right?" Judge 1 asked as I signed off on a motion. "Fine," I lied. Because what could I say? That the man who taught me silence was now about to stand before me and answer to the law. That justice sometimes wears the strangest masks. Thursday night, I ironed my robe with hands steadier than I felt. I polished the gavel, the wood worn, smooth from years of use. I caught my reflection in the mirror lines at the corners of my eyes, a gravity in my expression that hadn't been there at 19. I whispered aloud as if to practice court is in session. Friday came with gray skies again, the kind that made the courthouse dome look heavier than usual. I walked up the stone steps, each one an echo. Inside, the air smelled faintly of bleach and anticipation. The bailiff nodded. The clerk shuffled her papers. The gallery murmured in low tones. I took my seat on the bench, the robe settling on my shoulders like armor. The docket was read, case by case, until finally. State versus Richard Collins. The door at the side opened. Chains clinked faintly. And there he was. Older now hair. Thinner back, not as straight. But still him. Still the man whose voice had carved out my childhood, whose command had exiled me. He scanned the room, his eyes catching on mine. And for the first time in my life, I saw fear flicker across his face. The air in courtroom 3B was thick enough to touch. Every sound magnified the scrape of a chair leg, the shuffle of papers, the faint cough of someone in the gallery. When my father stepped inside, shackled by the weight of his own choices rather than iron, the room seemed to shrink around him. He looked smaller than I remembered, though not in height. His shoulders, once squared, like walls, slumped forward. The years had carved lines into his face, but pride clung stubbornly around his mouth. I had imagined this moment countless times in nightmares, in daydreams, in the quiet lull before a verdict. But nothing prepared me for the reality of him standing as defendant while I sat cloaked in authority. Case number 18243, State versus Richard Collins, the clerk intoned. My fingers curled around the gavel. For a heartbeat, I thought of 19-year-old me, suitcase in hand, the word never echoing like a curse. Then I struck the gavel against the block. The sound cracked like thunder. Court is in session. His face went white. I forced my voice steady formal. Mr. Collins, you stand accused of embezzlement and fraud. Counsel state your appearances for the record. The attorneys spoke, their voices distant compared to the roar in my head. I heard only fragments: misappropriation of funds, company pension, betrayal of trust. Words heavy enough to bury a man. My father shifted at the defense table. His suit was wrinkled too large, as if borrowed. His hands trembled slightly when he lifted a pen. I noticed details I never would have before: the raw edge of his cuticles, the hollow under his eyes. Time had not been kind. Yet, when the prosecutor began to outline the case, he raised his chin with the old defiance. Those books were a mess before I got there. He muttered loud enough for me to hear, though not enough to be on record. I kept my expression neutral. A judge does not flinch. But inside memories tangled the same stubborn denial he wore when my mother asked about bills, the same refusal to admit weakness when he lost his job years ago. Pride was the thread stitching his whole life, and it was unraveling right in front of me. Witnesses testified. Numbers were projected on the courtroom screen, account transfers highlighted in red. The prosecutor walked the jury through them step by step. My father's defense lawyer countered weakly, arguing oversight, poor accounting systems. But the evidence was clear, and with each exhibit I watched the fight drain a little more from my father's posture. During a recess, I retreated to chambers. Alone, I sat at my desk, staring at the gavel resting in front of me. It was only wood and weight, but it felt like a symbol carved by the years between us. I thought of the girl who once whispered apologies to keep peace at the dinner table. Now the same mouth commanded order. Back in the courtroom, the tension climbed. The prosecutor leaned on words like betrayal and deliberate. The defense leaned on mistake and misunderstanding. Through it all, my father's eyes flicked to me, searching, maybe pleading. At one point during cross-examination, he snapped, "I didn't steal a damn thing." His voice cracked like it used to across our kitchen walls. Gasps rippled through the gallery. "Mr. Collins," I said, my tone colder than marble, "you will control yourself in this courtroom." Our eyes locked. For a second, it wasn't judge and defendant. It was father and daughter, the same fury, meeting the same stubborn will. Only now, the roles had shifted. My command carried the weight of law, not fear. He swallowed hard, sat back down. The silence after was louder than his outburst. As proceedings continued, I caught glimpses of the jury. They weren't just evaluating evidence. They were measuring the man before them. A man who once seemed immovable, now looked fragile, exposed. The trial stretched over days, each one blurring into the next. By the time closing arguments arrived, the air felt brittle with expectation. The prosecutor's voice rang steady. This was not a mistake. This was a pattern, a deliberate act of deception. When the defense rose, his words sounded tired, like fabric worn thin. My client is not a criminal mastermind. He's a man who stumbled under financial strain. All the while, my father's eyes never left me, as if I could hand him back dignity with one gesture, one softened look. But my duty was not to him. It was to the law. When the jury filed out for deliberation, the room exhaled. My gavel rested silent, but the weight of it pressed against me like history itself. Hours passed. The clock ticked in long, deliberate beats. Finally, the jury returned. Everyone rose. I scanned the faces, solemn, resolved. The foreperson handed me the slip of paper. I read it silently first, then aloud. On the charge of embezzlement, we the jury find the defendant guilty. The word echoed, sharp and final. My father flinched, the fight in his eyes flickering out like a candle in wind. I struck the gavel once more. Order in the court. And for the first time since that night a decade ago, he obeyed my silence. The courtroom emptied slowly after the jury's verdict, but my father lingered at the defense table. His shoulders hunched, hands gripping the edge of the wood as if it were the only solid thing left. The bailiff waited patiently at his side. I sat still on the bench robe, heavy face carved into neutrality while my insides shifted like sand. Sentencing came a week later. Between then and now, I carried the weight of both judge and daughter. Each time I reviewed the pre-sentencing report, I thought of Sunday dinners of the maple tree in our yard, of my father's voice, booming, never come back. Now here he was, back not at the head of a table, but standing to hear what justice required. The prosecutor spoke first. This was not a one-time error, Your Honor. This was a repeated abuse of trust. Dozens of employees depended on those pensions he drained. Their words painted him in stark strokes: thief, liar, manipulator. The defense attorney countered, voice thinner. Mr. Collins is 65 years old with no prior criminal record. He made poor choices under financial strain, but is deeply remorseful. We ask for leniency. I glanced at my father. His jaw was set, but his eyes betrayed the fear he could not hide. And then, as if realizing the futility of denial, he stood to speak. His voice cracked when it came. I don't expect forgiveness, not from this court, not from the people I hurt, and not from you. He looked up at me, then eyes glassy. But I need you to know I thought I was protecting our family. I thought I was doing what had to be done. The silence that followed pressed into the walls. I held his gaze for a long moment. Memories flashing his hand, slamming the table, my mother's weary sighs, my own footsteps down the porch the night I left. All of it led here. When I finally spoke, my voice was clear, carrying across the hushed room. Mr. Collins, the law does not weigh intentions above actions. Your choices stole from people who trusted you. You are found guilty, and this court must honor that truth. I delivered the sentence, 5 years with possibility of parole. The bailiff moved to escort him away. As he passed, his eyes met mine once more. Not the glare of a man who demanded obedience, but the hollow stare of someone who had been undone by his own pride. And for the first time, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not vengeance, but release. When the gavel struck, I wasn't 19 anymore. I wasn't the girl gripping a suitcase in the dark. I was a judge, a woman forged in silence and struggle, now the one commanding order. The very words he had once used to exile me had brought me here to a place where his power ended and mine began. Later, when the courtroom was empty and my robe hung on its hook, I sat alone in chambers. Outside, traffic hummed, life moved on. I pressed my fingers against the polished gavel and whispered to the quiet room. Sometimes justice isn't about revenge. Sometimes it's about finally being heard. I thought of others who had been silenced, children told to be small women, told to obey people, told they weren't enough. My story was only one among many. But if telling it could help someone else stand taller, then maybe that was the deeper verdict. So I tell it now to anyone listening, to remind you that family can break you, but it can also forge you into steel. That the voices trying hardest to quiet you may be the ones most afraid of what you'll become. If you've ever walked out a door with nothing but your own name, hold it close. One day, it might be the gavel in your hand. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear that walking away isn't the end, it can be the beginning. And if you want to hear more stories like mine, subscribe and join me here again. Sometimes the past echoes like thunder, but together we can turn it into something that steadies us.